Okay, so welcome to today's colloquium. Next week's colloquium will be delivered by Krista Clark. She'll be speaking on the activist collector, recovering the story of an African-American woman in pre-apartheid South Africa. On February 16th and February 17th, there'll be a festival/symposium in honor of Jerry Allen. Information is available on our website. On March 22nd through March 24th, we'll have our 4th Black Portraitures Conference, The Color of Silence. And on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of MLK's assassination on April 6th, we'll have an all-day symposium entitled Martin Luther King, Life, Loss, and Legacy. Now please welcome to the podium John Komaroff. He's professor of African and African American Studies and Anthropology here at Harvard.
Thank you, Krishna. Wait a minute, John, let me open my bag.
Okay. Well, yeah, one can't get ahead of the game, Skip. It's a rare personal pleasure to introduce Zeb Dingley, who is one of the most remarkable young scholars whom I've had the personal pleasure both to teach and to learn from. The latter part, the learning from, outweighing the former, the teaching part, by a country mile. I've known Zeb since he was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. He traveled to South Africa with Jean and me in 2006, which has just reminded me, for an extended winter program abroad. Well, that is winter in Chicago, summer in South Africa, which was what made the program especially attractive for most students for whom the corporeal trumped the cerebral by a long way. Not so for Zeb, however, who always finds intellectual challenge and intellectual purpose wherever his life takes him. As a Chicago undergraduate, to disinter a long part, he showed an unusual scholarly precocity by producing a quite extraordinary multiple prize-winning BA thesis on a religious movement in Kenya based on independent field research framed by a sure grasp of the comparative issues and debates swirling around the contentious study of African Christianity. It really should have been published at the time, and it would have stood, I think, as one of the finest essays on the topic. What has always marked Zeb's work, in addition to his knack for asking sharply honed questions, is his extensive command of literatures across the social sciences and the humanities, from hard-edged topics in political economy to abstruse issues in analytic philosophy. What is more, he seems always to have something original to say, some novel argument to make, something critically acute to add value to his work, of which his doctoral study, from which today's talk is drawn, is a distinguished example. Zeb's forthcoming PhD at Chicago, which is jointly in history and anthropology, is founded on his extensive research in Kenya among Mijikenda peoples. The project, which is entitled Kinship, Capital, and the Occult on the south coast of Kenya, is a quite singular study of life under conditions of radical uncertainty, vulnerability, opacity. The peoples of this part of East Africa have been caught up in a world that, since the 19th century, has been buffeted by historical forces, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, that have led them to mistrust or appearances. Nothing much for them is to be taken at face value. Anything said or done or seen or heard may connote the exact opposite of what it pretends to be. Zeb offers an exquisite, a quite brilliant analysis of precisely why this is so, why these residents of this part of Kenya evince a chronic epistemic anxiety, and why this manifests itself in a vernacular hermeneutics of suspicion, a sense that hidden forces lie beneath and shape the world of everyday experience. In pragmatic terms, as he shows, this yields a moral economy founded on routine practices of self-protection, of securing one's body, one's home, one's settlement from attack, and of hiding one's own intentions and emotions, lest self-revelation open one up to the ways and means of witchcraft and other dark arts. Zeb's ethnography and documentary research is of the richest, most subtle that I've read in many years. But his doctoral study is much more than just a remarkable account of an African people caught up uneasily in a desperately precarious present, itself a chapter in the longue durée from a troubled past. Nor is his study just an analysis of another occult economy in Africa, although it is certainly that as well. It is also a profound reflection on the state of contemporary anthropological theory, offering, as it takes up many of the classical tropes and topics of the discipline, a cogent critique of the so-called ontological turn and of neo-empiricism more generally. Zeb's work is beginning to yield a rich stream of publications, soon to see the light of day, among them 3 quite remarkable essays. The first, History and Human Sacrifice in Mijikenda Myth and Ritual. The second, Rumour and History Revisited, Mumiani in Coastal Kenya to 1945. And thirdly, Mumiani Season, Visual Aesthetics of a Kenyan Moral Panic. Mumiani, for the 1 or 2 of you in the room who are not intimately familiar with coastal Kenya, are gangs that steal body parts and blood in the vampiric extraction of the life force of ordinary people for the purposes of the powerful. Path-breaking work this, work sure to leave a large footprint alike on African studies, anthropology, and history. Much more could be said about Zeb's scholarship, but it's unnecessary. He's also something of a Renaissance man, in case you don't know. Among other things, he's a former rugby player of quality, a competitive track athlete, a rock climber, an alpine mountaineer, a scuba diver, and a canoeist. As an undergraduate, he was also involved in the University of Chicago Ballet. He is also a registered emergency medical technician. This is worth knowing at the Hutchins Center. A certified rescue diver, which is useful for the Boston winter. A highly proficient language learner, in case you come across John Mugane. And a committed volunteer to such causes as the maintenance of U.S. historical sites, documentary records, communal arts projects, and what little remains of ethical labor relations. This all-roundedness feeds Zeb's scholarship. His various interests and activities are an integral dimension of his critical curiosity and his unremitting desire to interrogate the worlds, all of them, in which he has lived. Thank you, and welcome, Zeb.
I have to say that John was giving that wonderful introduction. And God, you are the multi-talented man. The Mellon Foundation just announced that Elizabeth Alexander is the new president of the Mellon Foundation, first African-American woman. And who's our dear friend. And this is huge. The Mellon Foundation is a $6 billion endowment, and now it's headed by a black woman. So I think we should give it up. Great. I don't tell her you won't clap, so we can get some money.
Okay, well, thanks, John, for the characteristically generous introduction.
We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, John, for the wonderful introduction. And thanks also to Skip and all of the staff at the Hutchins Center and the other Du Bois Fellows for creating such a wonderful intellectual home for this year. Is that better? All right. So this is a talk about drought, kinship, and unfree labor on the coast of Kenya. It's about rumor and history, blood and body parts, moral panics, and matrilineal descent. It's about the monstrous, vampires, mummies, and dismembered bodies, and the mundane, bureaucracy, infrastructure, and the weather. The argument is this. Recurrent rumors on the Kenyan coast about gangs of blood stealers called Watu wa Mumiani, Mumiani people, condense and represent layers of complex historical experience in a bodily idiom of depletion, danger, and death. These rumors synthesize pre-colonial medical knowledge, rituals of elder initiation, and social mechanisms for surviving ecological distress into news about the value of human life and the nature of colonial power. They're both an explicit commentary on and critique of the context in which they develop and circulate, and a way of talking about history, one whose truth claims and evidentiary standards are substantially different from those of professional historians. To put this in simpler, perhaps obvious terms, these rumors capture the imagination when and where they do, precisely because they do not come out of nowhere. Rumors are documents of the historical moments in which they circulate, but they also point to more distant pasts and indicate how the former is experienced and understood through the latter. In what follows, I want to focus on one instance of collective panic about Watu wa Mumiani in southern coastal Kenya at the end of World War II. I offer an interpretation of the episode in terms of a drought and a labor conscription scheme with which it overlapped. I argue that these fears not only developed out of older ideas about a medical technology called Mumiani, they also condense, in this particular episode, a more diffuse set of cultural memories of famine, pawnship, and avuncular authority that had become suddenly relevant again under the conditions of drought and labor conscription in which the rumors circulated. So this is thus not an argument about either the continuity or radical newness of what Louise White calls vampire stories, but rather about how diverse cultural phenomena are preserved, transformed, and refigured in moments of recognition. So here I draw inspiration from Walter Benjamin's notion of the historical constellation, the idea that under certain conditions, some aspects of the past, as it were, shine brighter than others and seem to be related to each other in a new, meaningful way, like the stars in a constellation. The Mumiani Panic of 1945 is one such moment in which certain aspects of the past are seen to resonate with the present in new ways, offering up a glimpse of the local significance of each through cultural ephemera such as rumor. In the field of African history, Louise White has made a compelling argument for the utility of communicative genres like rumor and gossip for writing African history. White's methodological innovation is to treat the geographically and historically widespread belief in blood-stealing figures in colonial Central and East Africa as a textual genre, which she calls vampire stories, focusing on the pattern of the tale, not the circumstances of the telling. By identifying formulaic elements, not as distortions of historical truth, but rather as key ingredients of a good and thus credible story, White has compiled what Nancy Rose Hunt calls the lexicon of debate. Colonial vampires, in this understanding, are an epistemological category with which Africans describe their world. As such, the formulaic elements of the stories told about them are tools with which to write and sometimes rewrite colonial history.
Could you project a little bit more?
I can try, yeah, thanks. White's approach is attractive in attempting to sidestep a positivist, constructivist impasse in African history in terms of how to deal with oral testimony. But as with any historical method, it's not without its own limitations. White bases much of her argument on narratives elicited in oral interviews in Nairobi in the mid-1970s, in Siaya district in 1986, and in and around Kampala in 1990. Partly because of how these stories are narrated in the continuous past tense, saying we were doing X, they used to do Y, and partly because of the apparent stability of a genre abstracted from concrete instantiations, the stories collected by White become, in effect, historical documents of colonialism, rather than lively circulating rumors or gossip about specific people or events. White's method thus allows her to illuminate certain aspects of the popular imagination in colonial-era East and Central Africa, and even to parse the concerns and relationships that these stories articulate by region. But it doesn't allow her to explain why these rumors, as rumors, come and go as they do, capturing public imagination in episodes of moral panic in one moment and fading away the next. This is related to a second issue with White's method. Echoing the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard's pithy insight that new situations demand new magic, White's colonial vampires are, she says, new imaginings for new relationships. But however new colonial vampires may have been, they were not entirely new or alien to African subjects. White acknowledges this, but the only kind of link to the pre-colonial period that she pursues is a genealogical one between vampire and witch as social types. Unlike witchcraft, which White understands to be an idiom for articulating tensions around intimacy in the kinship order, vampires, she says, had none of the personal malice of witches. It was a job. Vampires were seen to be internationalized, professionalized, supervised, and commodifying, and their outsiderness was foregrounded. But I want to suggest that White's distinction between witch and vampire in terms of intimacy and alterity is perhaps overdrawn. Vampire stories mark the foreignness, indeed, of a source of power and its demand for blood, but also an anxiety about the Africans who work for these colonial outsiders and who do the actual killing on their behalf. In other words, vampire stories articulate concerns about the familiar figures who mediate between foreign power and local communities. As with local ideas about witchcraft in South Coast Kenya, at least, vampire stories express less a fear of outsiders directly than a fear of betrayal by intimates, in this case, two outsiders. So vampires may thus be new imaginings for new relationships, but I want to suggest that they may also be reimaginings of old relationships in more abstract, stylized, or indirect form. Vampire stories, in other words, articulate contemporary relationships not only in terms of contemporary technologies, but in terms of a history of relationships and technologies. Or as White herself puts it, such stories are not constructed on a moment-to-moment basis. They're drawn from a store of historical illusions that have been kept alive and given new and renewed meanings by the gossip and arguments of diverse social groups. Building on White's innovative methods, then, part of my argument here is that identifying which elements these stories draw from this store of historical illusions will help us understand why stories become especially relevant under specific circumstances and not others. In other words, why does the past assume the specific historical constellation that it does when and where it does? So this, then, is the constellation. In his annual report for 1945, Digo District Commissioner Noel Frederick Kennaway describes an episode of panic that bears all the hallmarks of one of White's vampire stories. This is an extended quotation now from the report. After a lapse of some 7 years, the ancient and curious belief in Watu wa Mumiani again came to the fore. The scare lasted for several months before dying out. Mumiani is the name of an ancient Persian drug of great healing power. The present local belief is that this drug is made from the blood of human beings and that the blood is collected by gangs which work secretly at night. These gangs of Watu wa Mumiani are vaguely believed to be organized by government. The gangs are supposed to come by lorry from Mombasa and to seize any lone native that can be found. The victim is then slung from a tree by the feet and all blood drained from the body, which is then left as a mere bag of bones. During the height of the scare, no native would be out at night alone. The people armed themselves and slept in groups. Such was the degree of fear that, had an unsuspecting car or lorry driver stopped on the road at night near an armed village, the villagers would probably have slaughtered the occupants of the car or lorry and asked questions afterward. Fortunately, the scare passed off without any serious incident. The origin of the scare was probably, this is still Kennaway, the origin of the scare was probably due to two mysterious murders in Kilifi district. In one case, the victim's body was found hanging by its feet in a tree. In the other case, the body was face down in a puddle. The curious thing about these cases was that these bodies had been mutilated in the Boran and Abyssinian fashion. End of quote. So the historian James Brennan notes that analysis of events like this raises demands for speculation on evidence that's generally evocative but specifically elusive. In this case, Kennaway's report is the only archival trace of the 1945 panic, and the only hint of a possible local scare some 7 years earlier, he says. Neither episode stands out either in oral histories of Mumiani activity in the region, and so any interpretation of the 1945 panic is obliged to rely on abductive inference from indirect contextual clues. In order to arrive at a plausible explanation of the 1945 scare, then, why it took the form that it did, why the stories re-emerged when they did, what aspects of the past were brought to bear on this moment, and what their renewed salience tells us about how that moment was understood, I'll need to lay out a number of explanatory contexts, only some of which are indicated in the report itself. Kennaway presents two theories of Mumiani origins. So Mumiani, he writes, is the name of an ancient Persian medicinal drug of great healing power, and that the present local belief is that it's made from the blood of human beings. On one level, then, these rumors are understood to originate in contemporary medical theories with ancient roots. More proximately, however, Kenway speculates that the origin of the scare was probably due to the two mysterious murders in Kilifi district, an administrative unit just north of Digo district. Before proposing a different theory of the relation between the origin and power of these stories, let me first explore these two lines of explanation from Kenway, beginning with the ancient origins of medicinal Mumiani. The history of Mumiani is, in the first instance, the history of a substance variously referred to as mumia, mumiai, and mummy. The etymology is variously given as the Arabic or Persian mum, wax, amomum, a kind of perfume, and mumia, an embalmed body, a mummy. In the course of translating medical texts by Pliny, Dioscorides, and Galen from Latin and Greek into Arabic, and later those of Rhazes, Serapion, and Avicenna from Arabic into Latin and Greek, confusion emerged over whether mumia referred to preserved and perfumed corpses or to a waxy bituminous substance that was either an ingredient or an exudate of them. The medical community of early modern Europe remained divided over whether mumia referred to bodies or bitumen, whether one was an acceptable substitute for the other, and whether either had any medicinal value at all. Despite the uncertainty, European consumption, in this case quite literal, of Egyptian mummies, they were eating powdered mummies, between the 15th and 17th centuries outstripped the supply, leading to concerns over counterfeit mumia being made from the corpses of executed criminals and the bodies of the unclaimed dead. Mummy was available in the apothecaries and pharmacies of Europe well into the 18th century as a staple of both the Galenic and Paracelsian medical systems. And although popular memory of European medical cannibalism is repressed, to say the least, it appears in the work of contemporary artists, scientists, and intellectuals, from Jean Baudin, Francis Bacon, and Robert Boyle, to William Shakespeare, John Donne, and Samuel Johnson. Sale of medicinal mummy in Europe continued into the 20th century, with the German pharmaceutical company Merck selling Mumia vera aegyptica, a genuine Egyptian mummy, as late as 1924. But as European demand fell in the early 19th century, concern about counterfeit mummy made from the recently deceased gave way to the idea that authentic mumia is harvested not from ancient mummies, but from the bodies of those captured and killed specifically for its manufacture. A footnote in Raja Shiva Prasad's History of Hindustan from 1874 includes, among the nursery tales we heard in our childhood, that in Habash, Abyssinia, men make momiyai, a sort of medicine from the blood of the slain. And in East Africa, the Mombasa area missionary Johann Ludwig Krapf's Dictionary of the Swahili Language defines mumiani as a fabulous medicine which the Europeans prepare, in the opinion of the natives, from the blood of a man. And the dictionary was published in 1882, but that definition appears in a manuscript version from the 1850s. This newer conception, however, had not yet fully replaced the older one. In his 1870 Handbook of the Swahili Language as spoken at Zanzibar, the Bishop Edward Steer defined mumiani as a mummy still esteemed as a medicament. The 19th century Indian Ocean world was thus the scene of protracted uncertainty and debate over the nature, origins, and merit of medical technologies and techniques, including mumiani. So there's good reason then to question Peter Pells's argument that this was an Indian rumor brought to East Africa by Indian soldiers and police in the 1890s. As is well known, East Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East were part of an integrated cosmopolitan Indian Ocean world for several centuries before this relocation of a few hundred soldiers. The navigator who guided Vasco da Gama from Malindi in what is now Kenya to Calicut in 1498 was one of several Gujaratis he encountered in the Swahili city. And Amerigo Vespucci lists mummy as among the items carried by ships returning to Portugal in 1501 from a voyage that included stops in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, the Persian Gulf, and the Swahili coast. And when the Hamerton Treaty banning the export of slaves from the Sultan of Zanzibar's East Africa territories came into effect in 1847, Britain began settling recaptured slaves of East African origin at a Church Missionary Society station in Nasik near Bombay. Many of these individuals, the so-called Bombay Africans, were eventually returned to East Africa from India to assist in mission operations decades before the Indian soldiers singled out by Pell's arrived. Pell's article has the virtue of attempting to account for the timing of an East African Mumiani panic in 1904, but his claim hinges on the rough contemporaneity of rumors about Mumiani extraction by Indians in East Africa in 1904 to 1906, with rumors about Mumia extraction from Indians in British hospitals in India during the plague epidemic of 1896. But as we've seen, earlier Indian accounts already identified Mumia extraction as an African, Abyssinian phenomenon. Another colonial source, colonial Indian source from 1885 lists Mimiai as being a kind of bitumen said to be extracted from the heads of coolies who emigrate to the colonies by hanging them head downward and roasting them over a slow fire. Stories about Mumiani killings were thus not an Indian rumor at all, but rather expressed international concerns about the sources, availability, and effectiveness of global medical technologies on the one hand, and the fate of individuals swept up into global circuits of enslaved and bonded labor on the other, combining ideas about health and healing with speculation about the uses of life and the generation of value. Like Pell's, Kenaway offers an explanation of the rise of Mumiani rumor in terms of a roughly contemporaneous but slightly antecedent event. So recall that for Kenaway, the origin of the scare was due to these mysterious murders in Kilifi district, and that the curious thing about these cases was that the bodies had been mutilated in the Buran and Abyssinian fashion. I can find no other documentary reference to a body found hanging by its feet in a tree in Kilifi at this time, which for me raises the question of whether Kenaway may have been reporting as the factual origin of a mistaken Mumiani rumor what was, in fact, a piece of information related to him in an instance of that rumor's telling. On the other hand, there's evidence of an inquest into the death of a Giriama whose mutilated body was found in a pond in Kaloleni in September 1945. This was determined to be a case of murder by a person or persons unknown, and is presumably the body that Kenaway describes as having been found face down in a puddle. But what such a body would have to do with Mumiani is unclear. Mumiani, after all, leave their victims neither face down in puddles nor floating in ponds. They leave them hanging upside down from trees. The only detail common to both deaths in Kenaway's account was their post-mortem mutilation. And although such mutilation is not described as characteristic of Mumiani killings, it's on this basis that Kenaway links these incidents to the rumors about them. The deaths in Kilifi strike Kenaway as curious, and he draws a connection on this basis to the curious Mumiani rumors circulating in Digo. Kenaway describes the corpses as having been mutilated in the Buran and Abyssinian fashion, which is a polite way of indicating that the victim's genitals had been cut off. Although descriptions of unnamed East African peoples ritually emasculating the victims of initiatory killings can be found in 12th century Chinese encyclopedias and 16th century Portuguese accounts, 19th century missionary texts attribute the practice to the Gala, Oromo-speaking peoples, of which the Borana are one, of the northeast Kenyan, Ethiopian, Somali borderlands. In 1853, for instance, Kropf gives the following account, ostensibly a description of contemporary practice. This is an extended quote. Throughout the Gala nation, the abominable custom prevails to emasculate a prisoner of war, either when he is alive or slain in the battle. The trophy is after cleaning, stuffed with grass, and suspended in the door of the cottage. When about to marry a woman, the lover shows his trophy to her in sign of his bravery. Without this exhibition, a Gala cannot get a wife. He's consequently compelled to go to war or waylay innocent travelers of other nations until he gets his requisite for the marriage contract. But as he cannot always quickly succeed, he has found out the horrid expedient of buying a slave from the coast in order to cut his privacy and carry it to his bride. I have some years ago seen myself some slaves brought from Mombasa to the Gala market at Mberia, who were sold for this wicked purpose to the Gala, who sell their ivory to Mombasa partly on this count alone. Church Missionary Society catechist George David, himself a Bombay African, reported in 1877 that the Galas once had a law that no man should have a wife until he had killed a man, or at least produced his privy parts, and for this barbarous purpose they used to catch the wanika. The wanika is it's a derogatory term for the people who are now known as Mijikenda. It means the people of the bush or wilderness. It's unclear how far in the past David understands this law to have been in effect or when it stopped. But there's another important 19th century association on the Kenyan coast to ritual killing and mutilation. A ritual called Mungaro, which was a ritual of elder initiation. In 1845, Krop describes Mungaro as a horrible sport practiced from time to time by the young people when they have reached a certain age. They remain in the woods until they've killed a man. It's therefore not advisable to journey at such times through these places, as solitary travelers, especially slaves, are their favorite prey. And Krop advised travelers to ask after the time of the Wangaro of a village, as he might risk his life if alone on the road during its observance, because the ritual cannot terminate unless they have slain somebody in the fields or bought by common contributions a slave whom they may kill. In his opinion, the Wadigo, or Wanikas of the south, appear especially attached to this cruel practice. Though absent from 19th century descriptions, the mutilation of the victim's body is incorporated into 20th century descriptions of the Mungaro ritual, at which point it was no longer being performed. Take, for example, the description of Methodist missionary J.B. Griffiths in 1935. This quote, they formed themselves into parties and went in quest of the initiation victim, who had to be a man of an enemy tribe, and whose right hand and sexual organs they had to take to the elders. While they roamed, their object was to watch the main paths which led to an enemy country. So by the mid-1940s, in other words, when Kenaway reported curious deaths in Kilifi district as the origin of Mumiani rumor in Digo district, mutilation in the Boran and Abyssinian fashion had been fully incorporated into Mijikenda understandings of their own ritual history. What these accounts of 19th century ritual killings and mutilation on the Kenyan coast share with 20th century Mumiani rumor is a clear sense of vulnerability of individual travelers on roads and paths. A solitary traveler might risk his life if alone on the road during Mungaro. The Gala waylay innocent travelers and catch the Wanika for initiation into marriageable adulthood. Seizure and death along roads and paths is also a central narrative of early 20th century Mumiani rumor. And both Mungaro and Mumiani stories relate this anxiety about danger along paths to political power. Mungaro involves a ritual killing and mutilation at the hands of senior men as part of their initiation into pre-colonial political office. Mumiani identifies this periodic killing and draining of victims as an element of the colonial government power that organizes it. As the political ritual of Mungaro faded from practice at the end of the 19th century, Mumiani imaginaries changed as well, from a medicine made from African blood by Indians and Europeans to murderous gangs of fellow Africans. So 19th century accounts of ritual killing and mutilation by both Nika and Gala men share another important theme, slavery. So if a Gala man is unable to abduct and murder a lone traveler or kill an enemy in combat, Krop claims that a slave may be purchased for this wicked purpose. Indeed, all 19th century sources but one mention a slave victim as an acceptable alternative to a stranger, or in Griffith's early 20th century account, a man of an enemy tribe. But David's report on Gala predations includes an additional reference to the vulnerability of enslaved people in connection with initiatory killings by powerful others. After the Wanika abandoned the northern territory that they had shared with the Gala, escaped slaves from the coast took their place, putting themselves under Gala protection and rendering tribute in return. The escapees, in a sense, successfully domesticated Gala violence with unspecified payments of tribute. But George David suggests that this arrangement was, by the late 19th century at least, breaking down. So now that the Gala fear a white man is coming, they are beginning to sell the slaves, he says. So speculation about the social and economic consequences of growing British presence in the region, the Gala began kidnapping and selling back into slavery those who had sought refuge in their patronage. The theme of slavery and subordination in these narratives provides an important clue to the timing of the 1945 Mumiani panic. Without undertaking a detailed analysis of the 19th century regional slave economy, a brief discussion of certain key dimensions is in order before returning to the 1945 episode. So in what follows, I focus on pawning and the importance of kinship as an idiom or ideology of power and patronage. In the second half of the 19th century, a series of treaties between Britain and Zanzibar slowly restricted the exportation of slaves from East Africa into the broader Indian Ocean world.
Was that? When?
The second half of the 19th century. Yeah. Limitations on slave exports meant that the number of enslaved people available for purchase locally increased until the overland trade in slaves was abolished in 1876. During this period, slave raiding in the coastal hinterland also increased, and the paths connecting fortified settlements became increasingly threatening spaces of potential abduction and enslavement. Following a brief decline in the wake of the 1876 treaty, a substantial revival of the slave trade took place in 1884, lasting for several years. This coincided with a major famine, remembered in southern Kenya as the Mwakisenge famine, affecting much of the coastal hinterland and the interior. Faced with starvation, many southern Mijikenda pawned themselves or their children to the coastal plantation owners who had been spared the drought afflicting the immediate hinterland. This was to be only the first in a series of disastrous famines and food shortages coinciding with the imposition in first few decades of European overrule. So in 1889 to 1890, 1894 to 96, 1898 to 1900, 1901, 1904, 1907, 1912, 1914, 1915, 1917, 1921. Endemic famine during this period put already marginal individuals in a precarious position. At risk of capture while searching for food, their positions within the homestead was also increasingly tenuous as political pawns. That is, of being temporarily exchanged to wealthy coastal patrons in exchange for food or money, with the possibility of redemption at some later date. Children were especially at risk of kidnapping or pawning by senior male kin, either to retire a debt as security for a loan or in exchange for grain or food to sustain the rest of the homestead. At the same time, as Justin Willis and Suzanne Myers show, the second half of the 19th century saw the progressive erosion of strategies available to dependents. The increased availability of bought slaves in the latter part of the 19th century enabled these new men to reduce the autonomy of all their dependents, whether they were bought as slaves or acquired in other ways. So while an earlier generation of dependents may have been able to seek favorable terms of patronage elsewhere when threatened with pawning, the increased availability of cheap slaves for purchase in the later 19th century meant that they were increasingly at the mercy of powerful new homestead heads. Kinship was the shared idiom of excision and incorporation in such circumstances, and the language of kinship remains important in a range of semi-permanent custodial and squatting arrangements in southern coastal Kenya today. And pawning is still cited by older Digo and Duruma as the basis of their historically matrilineal inheritance. And so as this is articulated, a man inherits from his mother's brother because his mother's brother has the right to pawn him. Although such formulations clearly beg the question, historians and anthropologists alike have reported them as ethnographic realities rather than statements of ideology, or they tended to anyway. This is not to deny the importance of kinship in pawning practices on the Kenyan coast, but rather to specify the nature of that importance as a mediating ideology or idiom, if one prefers, rather than as an ascriptive structuring framework. In a social context characterized by contradictory rights in people on competing grounds, a classificatory kinship terminology, and preferential cousin marriage, successful claims to and public recognition of specific relationship statuses are less pre-existing realities than politically and economically inflected social interactional achievements. This last point will become especially important in the context of the conflicts discussed in a moment among homestead heads over junior male labor during the colonial labor conscription scheme leading up to the Mumiani Panic of 1945. It also bears mentioning that the language of kinship in southern coastal Kenya is also the language of shared blood. The loss of kin in these pawning arrangements is thus also the loss of shared substance, a kind of blood sacrifice in which the survival of the kin group is predicated on the loss of a carefully calculated and debated quantum of the blood that binds the matrilineal segment together. So in pre-colonial Mijikenda society, the alternative frameworks of authority and social control included an age grade system, from the highest ranks of which were drawn councils called Ngambi of senior men from resident lineage groups. Mungaro, described earlier, was the ritual of initiation into the Ngambi, which had the power to allocate land, adjudicate disputes, and impose fines for legal and ritual infractions. Alongside and overlapping with the membership of the age grade system and Ngambi Council were secret societies or ritual guilds responsible for the provision of rainfall, the administration of oaths and disputes, and the performance of specialized mortuary ritual among members. Membership in these societies was based neither on one's age grade nor one's matrilineal clan identity, but rather on one's ability to muster the substantial fees required for initiation. Partly as a result of the general disruption of coastal society in the later 19th century due to droughts, food shortages, epidemics, epizootics, and war, and partly due to the administrative measures of the Imperial British East Africa Company and beginning in 1895 of the British government, the system of age grade sets and Ngambi councils was eroded and eventually lapsed entirely. Power became increasingly localized as homestead heads developed new ritual forms which emphasized their autonomy and their own authority, and local councils of homestead heads, like these guys here, usurped the prerogatives of elders in the dispensation of justice. When the Kenyan coastal strip was reconstituted as a British protectorate in 1895, these new men who had risen to prominence in the late 19th century were recognized by the administration as traditional authorities rather than the more senior, and within the epistemological frame of the administration itself, more traditional members of the Ngambi Council and age grade system. Their large followings made the new men men of influence, with the ability, it was hoped, to supply labor for the reorganized regional economy to which the colonial administration aspired. The administration took important steps to strengthen the position of these traditional authorities with respect to the labor question. In 1902, the Village Headman Ordinance recognized these figures as administrators and gave them legal powers to compel labor for the upkeep of any public road adjacent to their village. This was superseded in 1912 by the Native Authorities Ordinance, which empowered chiefs and headmen to demand 24 days of unpaid labor per year from each able-bodied man in the village for work on projects constructed or maintained for the benefit of the community. It also empowered them to fine any village resident who failed to comply. Such measures were self-consciously a means of driving young men into the labor market out of the native reserves. As Chief Native Commissioner John Ainsworth put it in 1918, in this procedure lay our hope that the young man will prefer to leave their reserve for work outside, one reason being that work in the reserves is not paid for. The Native Authorities Ordinance was amended in 1920 to include payment for communal work, but also increased the annual labor requirement from 24 days to 60, with exemptions available to those who had been otherwise employed for 3 out of the previous 12 months. So by creating new state-backed forms of power and corresponding incentives for junior men to dodge them by either abandoning the reserves as casual laborers in Mombasa or as squatters on defunct coastal plantations, these measures aggravated existing intergenerational tensions and introduced a new source of intragenerational conflict. These conflicts over labor, who had the right to dispose of the labor power of others, who the right to compensation, and what the nature of the relationship between parties was, all have roots in pre-colonial relations of patronage, dependency, and indebtedness that included the pawning, abduction, and sale of individuals in times of scarcity, transacted through the idiom of kinship. The durability of these pre-colonial concerns and their transformation in the early colonial period are key to understanding the timing of the Mumiani panic that unfolded in Digo district in 1945, coinciding as it did with the failure of the short reigns on the one hand, and a large-scale wartime civil labor conscription scheme on the other. So in Digo district, which is now Kwale County, 1945 is remembered as the Mwaka wa Taveta, the year of Taveta. Between June 1944 and October 1945, the colonial government conscripted over 1,500 Digo men for labor on sisal farms and an irrigation project in Taveta district in support of the British war effort. Although the conscription campaign was formally conducted through the relatively new administrative apparatus of chiefs and headmen, the traditional authorities empowered by the state to supply conscript labor, in practice, conscription was effected through kinship-mediated relations of authority and subordination within and between individual homesteads. While monthly intelligence reports record the number of conscripts, summonses, rejections, and tribal police required for enforcement, what emerged most clearly in oral histories I collected in 2015 was conflict between men and their brothers-in-law over the right to pawn their sons to the colonial state. What was, from one perspective, bureaucratic administrative exercise was, for Digo district residents, the reintroduction of a form of bondage that had only recently been abolished. Informants disagreed over whether it was men's fathers or maternal uncles who had the authority to force them into these labor contracts. Most asserted that the recruitment was undertaken on a homestead-by-homestead basis, that the district commissioner or district officer would hold a meeting announcing the labor quota and then send chiefs to collect one laborer from each homestead, for which the homestead head was responsible. Who a homestead head was able to send thus depended on the composition of the homestead in each instance. If he had managed to retain his sisters and their sons, he was in a better position to volunteer one of his nephews in hopes of preventing his sons and their mother from fleeing to their maternal uncle in defiance. In fact, two informants claimed that the demand for labor during the Mwaka wa Taveta put such strain on the structural conflict between fathers and mothers' brothers over women and children that it broke the pre-colonial system of inheritance from one's mother's brother, ideologically grounded as it was in his right to pawn his sister's son. And shortly after the Mwaka wa Taveta, the local native councils began holding votes on whether to change their kinship systems from matrilineal to patrilineal descent. So one informant made the connection between conscription and pawning explicit, adding that, like pawning, conscription was not expected to be permanent. Laborers hoped to return home when the contract was finished, although, as with 19th century pawns, not all did. Some compared the work to slavery, in that the work was not paid, that workers were just fed and clothed. Others denied that this was the case, on the grounds that the government had just ended slavery and could not simply take people for work without pay. Under the terms of the Defense African Labor for Essential Undertakings Regulation 1944 and Central Wage Board Circulars 9 and 10 of 1944, conscripts were to be paid 10 shillings per ticket contract, each ticket consisting of 30 standard task units, in which each unit was equivalent to what was deemed to be 1 day's work. But whereas the Native Authorities Ordinance had entitled chiefs and headmen to 60 days of communal labor over the course of a year, conscript contracts under the defense regulations were for 9 tickets or 12 continuous months, whichever were completed first. So conscripts could theoretically return home early by completing all 9 tickets before the 12 months had elapsed, but they could not be retained after the 12-month period if they had failed to complete all 9 tickets, although a number of the states on which they were employed tried to do this. Unlike those compelled to work, under the Native Authorities Ordinance on projects for the benefit of the community, while continuing to live at home, conscripts were given 14 days in which to settle their affairs and report to the district officer. before being subjected to a medical examination and sent to a regional labor camp. Much of this labor was allocated to private estates owned by settler corporations. This situation was accepted only with reluctance by His Majesty's government. On the question of its necessity was raised from time to time in the House of Commons. There were widespread concerns about the exploitation of compulsory labor for private profit, including the retention and letting out of conscripts for work in the vicinity of the camps on projects not considered to be essential undertakings for the war effort. So, wages notwithstanding, then, the compulsory labor scheme was a disconcertingly unfree form of labor for both the British government and its Kenyan subjects. The launch of the conscription campaign in Digo district in 1944 also coincided with a regional famine that necessitated the distribution of relief rations by the government. This only compounded local understandings of the situation as one of pawning. As in the pre-colonial period, domestic groups received food aid from wealthy patrons in exchange for security in the form of a pawned person. This was the local understanding. Unlike the pre-colonial period, however, this was not an arrangement reluctantly sought out by famine-stricken households, but one imposed by an inscrutable foreign power with whom no fictive kinship relations could be established. Evasion and desertion became increasingly common when the conscription continued after the famine relief ended, and tribal police were used to catch deserters and enforce summonses. Among the wartime labor projects in Kenya, the Taveta irrigation scheme, on which the labor from Digo district was primarily employed, the Taveta irrigation scheme was among the most hazardous, giving labor inspectors grounds for anxiety on the score of health and its higher than average death rate. By the end of 1945, when the short rains again failed and Mumiani rumors began, Kenaway complained that it had become increasingly difficult to find men for conscription. Now, other than waged work, there are few local mechanisms under famine conditions for metabolizing life into an edible exchangeable form of value, like grain or the cash with which to purchase it. In the past, pawning had been one such mechanism. The administration unwittingly revived it during the Second World War on an expanded scale and in a bureaucratized form. Although clearly molded by wage labor, a certain amount of money for a certain amount of work in a certain amount of time, conscripts and their families were, and remain to this day, uncertain as to whether or not they were to be paid for the work and what the moral basis of the contractual relation was. To them, it bore a strong resemblance to an older contractual form, pawning, in which food aid, now famine relief, was received in exchange for the transfer of junior kin and their labor. So the 1945 Mumiani panic unfolded in this context of regional famine and labor conscription through pawning or police capture. One interviewee speculated that while Watu wa Mumiani are real, the stories told about them during the Mwaka wa Taveta had been concocted to scare people into remaining in their homesteads or work sites and not escape conscription by hiding in the bush. And although it's a detail not mentioned in Kenaway's report, others recalled that during the Mwaka wa Taveta, the Watu wa Mumiani set up hidden encampments in the forest from which to conduct their campaign of abduction and murder. But there's another local theory for the sudden return of Mumiani people near the end of 1945. According to local hydrological theory, failure of the rains entails not just the absence of coolness and moisture, not just the lack of something that should be there, but the presence of something that should not, a hotter than normal sun. This environmental condition is understood to have consequences for the human body, thinning the blood and accelerating its movement through the body. The resulting bodily condition is experienced as one of both anxiety and lethargy, agitation and weakness. And as one woman explained it, Mumiani are perfectly aware of these effects and readily take advantage of them. So not only is blood thinner and easier to drain quickly, but food prices go up and money becomes scarce. Under these circumstances, people are willing to engage in all manner of unsavory activity to survive, including cooperating with the Watu wa Mumiani, selling junior kin to these outsiders in exchange for money or food support. In local understandings, then, Mumiani are pragmatic, rational actors, maximizing efficiency within a regionally shared understanding of how environmental conditions affect human physiology. And in this way, the episodic nature of Mumiani predations is conceptually linked to the periodicity of drought. Now, in a recent article, Aaron Pettigrew has drawn attention to the likelihood of connections between the social stresses occasioned by periods of drought to accusations of vampirism in colonial Mauritania. But what stands out in the case of Mumiani predations in southern coastal Kenya is that the relationship between drought and blood stealing is an explicit dimension of the local theory of why these vampires operate when and where they do. In other words, the claim of a connection between Mumiani and drought is both an analytic and an ethnographic one. So in conclusion then, in the 19th century, Mumiani went from being an ancient Persian drug of great healing power to a fabulous medicine which the Europeans prepare from the blood of a man. In the Indian Ocean world, the scene of movements back and forth of enslaved Africans and indentured Indians, Mumiani was variously understood to be made from the melted fat of Indian boys or extracted from the head of coolies who emigrate. The 19th century also saw the last performances of Mungaro, a ritual of senior male initiation involving the abduction and killing of a lone traveler from a path, and in later understandings, the mutilation of his body in the Baran and Abyssinian fashion. So the synthetic image of the Watua Mumiani in 1945 condenses and reimagines these layers of historical experience in a context in which they have become suddenly relevant, one of drought, disappearance, and mysterious death. They're not simply new imaginings for new relationships. They're also new imaginings of older relationships and of the older imaginings of those relationships, transfiguring 20th century understandings of 19th century practices of ritual, kinship, and power into a new constellation at a moment of ecological distress in which the southern Miji Kenda were obliged, in effect, to pawn their relatives to powerful new patrons on an industrial scale. Thanks.
Can you? That was fascinating.
Thank you.
John, you want to start off?
Sure. This is indeed fascinating, and there are lots of dimensions to it that I'd love to explore further. But two questions for now. One is methodological, theoretical. You started off with an exposition of Louise White on rumor and historical thought. And yet, as you moved into your analysis, it becomes basically a social history. How do you connect those two pieces of what you're doing? That's the first thing. The second thing is this. The conditions which you describe in this part of Kenya replicate themselves in colonial periods elsewhere, but what is specific about this is the vampiric nature of the form of occult action. In the other parts of especially East Africa, what occurred were witch-killing movements, etc., etc. Why does this adhere around vampirism rather than around more orthodox ideas of witchcraft, body part seizure, etc.? What is the particularity here about the vampiric?
Well, I think an important thing to note is that as Louise White points out, Mumiani don't replace witches in the local imagination. The figure of the witch persists alongside this newer figure of Mumiani, and I think speak to different sets of concerns. I think the Mumiani, I think that the anxiety that's being grappled with is the sense of betrayal to outsiders, rather than betrayal by an insider that you thought had your best interests at heart, but is secretly trying to kill you. In terms of the relation between...
No, that's tied up with relations between mother's brother and
Yeah.
husband, because that's deeply the tradition.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's absolutely part of it. And that's the way that in contemporary scares about Mumiani, it's a kind of betrayal by those that you should be able to trust. So what people would say in 2013, there was a scare about Mumiani while I was there. And the anxiety then was about young men, not old men, interestingly, so it's changed, about young men who are unemployed but have kind of mounting social responsibilities. They may be married or have children but no income to speak of. And again, it coincided, this 2013 episode coincided with a drought and a political campaign. The idea was that these young men were themselves vulnerable to the temptation of striking a deal with these Mumiani people to trick children into their vehicles, for instance, by saying, like, your parents sent me to go get you. We need to go in this car, in exchange for money. So the difference is not the fact of betrayal by those you should trust, but I think it's the source of power that's organizing that betrayal. In the case of Mumiani, it's an outsider.
How's this different than slavery?
How is it different than?
Slavery. Are these like could you write a history of forms of slavery, history of slavery, and talk about some of these things as forms of enslavement? You're selling off people.
Yeah, I think that's part of the argument that I'm making. Is that,
Okay. I mean,
but
you're very polite about it and explaining it.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at it in front, you go, damn, slavery's still here, and
Yeah.
it's been justified in complex ways.
Yeah.
But what's pushing the engine? Is it really, is it economic relationships which are then being mystified through all these rituals? You see what I mean? If you say the common, I'm just making this up, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I might as well, I'm out there, I might as well keep on going. If you say the thing that human bondage has in common is the capture and exploitation of someone's labor for free, right? I mean, just as a broad definition of what enslavement. Their unwilling participation, right?
Yeah.
And their loss of personhood, etc.
Yeah. Sure.
What's the difference between these forms and the slave trade from 1501 to 1866? Absent the black-white, though there's all kind of complex racial and ethnic difference embedded in this, of course.
Yeah, well, I
just to ask a casual
sure.
question.
Well, I think that it is in a form of enslavement, or unfree labor, however one wants to describe it. And
yeah, I like the word slavery.
Sure. Which the early missionaries themselves participated in, using slaves to build mission stations and things like that. And the Bombay Africans who were returned were also involved in a kind of regional trade in slaves that sought refuge with the mission stations. But I don't want to suggest that this is a kind of misunderstanding of like an economic reality that's just been kind of mystified and these people don't know. The people that I spoke to were definitely aware of the economic reality, if one wants, of the Makawa Taveta, that people were being taken to work on an irrigation project and not being paid.
That was the British idea, right? Isn't that during
World War II, yeah.
Sizable
Yeah, exactly.
But the Brits put that in motion.
Yeah, exactly.
Operates in the black-on-black forms.
Sure, you mean the kind of pawning arrangements of I think that it is a form of slavery, although the forms of dependency and unfreedom on the Swahili coast, especially during the 19th century, early 20th century, are complex, and there's a range of different kind of subordinate statuses that people are able to move through. There's a great deal of negotiation that goes on. But the legal status of slave wasn't abolished in Kenya until 1907. And slave markets were operating more or less openly into the 20s, I think, at least.
How about Zanzibar?
Yeah, oh, sure. Sorry, yeah, go ahead. No. Oh, no, just to as a kind of an afterthought, that these Mumiani stories bear a resemblance to certain stories that are have been interpreted as memories of the slave trade in West Africa, like the kind of red cloth stories, or like the vampire cowries, the idea that the cowries which were used as money were obtained by dunking people in the lagoons and then bringing their body back up covered in cowries, which would then be scraped off and used for the Rosalind Shaw and Josephina Corey and other people have written about this.
Lily?
Yes.
You need a microphone, Joe. Coming over. Oh, did I steal your... You'll be next. Yeah, who is? Well, just follow Christian's order and ignore me.
Before I ask my main question, I can't avoid asking what were the Europeans using when they were eating these mummy powders? But my main question is the following. This is an extremely rich analysis because you have this enormous depth in historical sources, and I'm very envious of that. But I think that what I want to ask about is first of all, I think that the use of vampire is very misleading.
Sure.
And what I'm interested in is the variation in these various ideas about sucking, taking away from. And as I've already told you this before, but in Malawi, for example, the people accused of blood sucking are never intimates. It's witchcraft that has to do with the jealousy and envy, etc., of intimates, especially since I'm talking about a matrilineal group, which is rather different from yours. But therefore, the question is, how do we come to terms with the fact that there are both the obvious patterns, the connections with certain conditions, enormously stressful conditions, the connection with older historical notions of what is life, what is strength, and taking away from those. And yet there are distinct variations across regions that are not terribly far removed from one another. And I wondered if you could reflect briefly on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, one way of trying to deal with it is Louise White's approach, which is it seems to relate the kind of broad semantic affordances of images like things like blood and specific new technologies in different regions. She talks about in other parts of Kenya, the Mumiani were associated with firefighters. Fire engines, uniforms, hydraulic pumps, rubber hoses. In other places, they're associated with medical technology, syringes, bandages. In other places with game rangers. In other places, it's Catholic priests. I think what they all have in common is this focus on blood and the extraction of blood by different means and by different people in each case. And for White, at least, it's articulating what are different regional concerns.
But you also have the intimates, and that seems to be the draining of more than blood, labor, strength. And I think that not enough has been done on this in Malawi, frankly. I mean, a lot of the analyses have been fairly superficial. Sure. But my sense is that sometimes blood becomes a representative of the of the life force,
Yeah, sure.
which of course is connected to the body parts as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm interested in the fact that in your case, both intimates and these various strangers of different types are involved, and that seems to me to be a fairly large difference, and maybe it's connected with the patterns of pawning that are so much more dramatic on the coast than they are elsewhere. I'm just wondering about the kind of questions we should be asking about these kinds of information.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in this case, the blood is both. When people are talking about blood, they're talking about the actual physical substance, but also this kind of life force, vitality. And what happens during drought is that the blood itself thins, and this results in a kind of bodily condition of wasting. But they really are talking about draining the physical. In other places, it's a kind of like, I think that like in Malawi, it's a kind of it's when the language of blood is used to describe kind of draining of the life force, but not the actual physical blood. When Pettigrew is talking about Mauritania, it's both. Again, it's remote, so there isn't like a physical like an operation being done on the body, but the blood is being extracted remotely by a vampire. The idea is that if you cut the victim of a remote vampire's body open, they'll be completely dry of blood. Oh, yeah, and mummy powder. It seems to be pulverized mummy. Why?
What was it supposed to do?
It depends on the medical system that it was a part of. So for Paracelsus, the Paracelsian system, mummy was a kind of life force. So that, and this is, I think, part of what feeds the shift from it being these embalmed Egyptian corpses to people captured and killed for its manufacture. Paracelsus thought that the mumia extracted from young people's bodies who had met a violent, sudden death was more vital and potent than the mumia extracted from an aged person, which was kind of depleted and weak. So it was this kind of essence of life that would have a kind of regenerative effect on the body. But for Dioscorides and Galen, these earlier figures, it was used. It's described as being a remarkable remedy for bruising and broken bones. Yeah, sure.
Zeb, thanks for that paper. It's a great reminder of what immersive fieldwork can bring with the richness that you give us here.
Thank you.
I had one incredibly short, simple question and one slightly more complicated one. The simple one is there any relationship to Mumia, the Wanga Nabongo, who's in Western Kenya, this hugely prominent figure at the time? Yeah. And then the second one is to take you to the second half of the 19th century, where so much of your story is founded. You're, in some sense, replicating those late 19th century texts in that you're talking about the Gala and the Nika and all these sorts of things. This, of course, is that great era where people are incredibly mobile in Eastern Kenya. People are moving, quote-unquote, tribes because of the famines and so forth. Yeah. So bearing in mind that we're talking about things like quite subtle concepts like pawnship and inheritance and descent and all these things, is there a sort of creation of tribalism story in there? Does that have any impact in this? Or could you just comment on that?
On the first question, there doesn't seem to be any connection between Mumia and Wanga. Also, is the name of a form of witchcraft on the coast that has no connection to seems to have no connection to the Western Kenyan people. With respect to the creation of tribalism, I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I think that rather than try to adjudicate like what's really going on in terms of how people are understanding their group membership, dealing with it at the level of ideology. So it's in some ways not interested in whether or not there really was a body found hanging from its feet in a tree in Kilifi district, mutilated in the Buran and Abyssinia, but or whether the people identified in these early Chinese and Portuguese sources, whether these East African people really were engaged in these kind of initiatory killings. It's the fact that the idea is circulating not only in the region but throughout the Indian Ocean world. Whether or not it's really happening, it's happening at the level of ideas, and so it's feeds into what's really happening in the context of the Mumiani panic, for instance.
Final question?
Thank you for your paper. I have a question about your analysis, and if I remember correctly, Louise White and others who've worked on rumor, sure, witchcraft, and other topics have discussed the ways that these types of narratives about vampires and witchcraft can be critique, and you mentioned that in your introduction, can act as a kind of critique, cultural critique of colonial rule, especially in the case of Louise White, for example, so that it becomes an idiom of discussing the way in which, so blood-sucking is an idiom of, that describes how colonial powers extracted something from the land and something from the bodies of the people that they colonized. Yeah. So I wonder where that idea plays a role here, and also how you bridge the gap, or the perhaps gap, between that and the fact that when we say that there have been recent work that have found that blood-sucking, in the Malawian case, for example, more recently, is in fact not at all an idiom for say, white foreigner medical researchers have been doing in Malawi, but in fact they literally are taking the blood of Malawians for the purpose of medical research. There's a concreteness there that seems to surpass the culture, or at least is not quite the same as saying that it's a cultural idiom. So I wonder how that kind of idea or sort of sets of analyses work in your context.
Yeah. Well, I think that in Louise White's work, to be honest, I think she hedges a bit. Like on the one hand, she wants to say that these are not metaphors, that these are, she's taking them at face value as statements about the world. But she also clearly treats them as kind of metaphors. In other places, she explicitly says that they are a metaphor for. I think, as I said in response to Skip's question, I don't want to say that these are a kind of like mystification or like that they are just a kind of metaphorical critique of. I think that they're part of a broader critique about these kinds of intermediary figures, like the local Native Council members. There is, I think that there is a little bit of a question of whether this is something that's really going on or not. So the case that the cases that Kenway points to may or may not have really happened. There is a cross-border trade in albino body parts, for instance.
For what? For magical purposes?
Yeah.
I suppose the question is how would it change our analysis, and you can't perhaps answer this now, but how would it change our analysis just just assume that they did happen? Like, would it just say, okay, they happened? Like, that's not going to be the question. We'll just take them as sort of something that occurred, at least, as far as this sort of historical record allows us to, and what does that add, or what kind of, change does that give it to analysis, instead of putting it constantly into question of, like, can we know what really happened?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it would change my analysis. I mean, there are certainly people who, and Louise White's interviewed them, who say that they were Mumiani and that there were pits in the fire stations that they would suspend people over and drain their blood. And I've talked to a number of people who have had nocturnal encounters with Mumiani that they've escaped. But I guess the question is whether and why. The question, I think, is the same: is why do these panics about them emerge when and where they do, and if it's enough that one of these attacks did happen, or whether there has to be some other contextual elements that let it erupt into one of these episodes of panic.
Thanks so much, Zeb. It's fascinating.
Thank you.